shock. In the dark.
I grew up in the 70s. That was an amazing time to be alive. I had G.I. Joe, Evel Knievel, $6 Million Man, Matchbox cars, and my favorite, those little green army men. I had thousands of them. I would spend all day making forts for them out of shoeboxes and then setting them up. My mom and dad were hippies. Not real hippies, but they just loved hippie stuff. Incense, patchouli, beads, tapestries, crystals, chakras, and we were all vegetarian. Animal lovers, too. We had so many pets over the years while I was growing up, but at this time I think our only pet was our retriever named Victory. I had a permanent pillow fort in my room. I had talked my parents into buying me a bunch of 1-inch thick PVC pipe for my birthday, and I made a sturdy structure. Basically, it was kind of a maze. You would crawl in, work your way down the tunnel to a dead end, but there was a secret door obscured by a blanket that led to my secret private cave. I was small and had a big imagination, but still it seemed like my little private pillow fort hideout was huge. Like the TARDIS. It really did seem way bigger on the inside than the outside. I would spend hours and hours in my secluded retreat reading comic books, playing with Matchbox and Hot Wheels cars, playing with our dog Victory, and generally just hanging out with my imaginary friend. But time went by and I had become a man, so I put away my childish things, and those days became distant memories. But one night, it all came rushing back, and I was reminded of some things I'd completely blocked from my memory. I had moved out of state when I was 19 and had rarely been able to visit my parents in the decade that followed, but in 1996, I was leaving one job but didn't need to report to my new job for 2 months, so I took that opportunity to visit my hometown. You know, see my old friends and especially spend time with my parents. I actually stayed in my old room. The pillow fort was long gone by then, but it was nice to be back in my space. One night after dinner, we were all sitting around relaxing, drinking coffee and telling stories about the good old days when the subject of my pillow fort came up. During a lull in the conversation, my dad said, "Remember that imaginary friend of yours?" My mom was suddenly very visibly angry at my dad. I said, "What?" Nobody said a word. My mom just sat there glaring at my dad. "What?" I said. My mom finally said, "Do you remember?" I said, "I guess so." I tried to think of the name and it just wouldn't come to me. My mom, as if she could read my mind, said, "Eduardo. His name was Eduardo." Ah, Eduardo, yes. Suddenly it all came rushing back. My imaginary friend Eduardo. At the time I thought he was my age, but as I see him in my mind's eye now, he is elderly. A little tiny elderly person. He always wore the same thing, white shirt with a white ribbed t-shirt underneath, brown suspenders, black business socks, no shoes, and light gray speckled pants that reminded me of the look and feel of the carpet you would find in the trunk of a car. I finally asked my mom directly, "Okay, cough it up. What's the deal with the imaginary friend?" After some false starts and hesitation, my mom got off to a careful start in telling the story. She told me how she first became concerned about my imaginary friend because I talked about him like he was real. I would readily admit other imaginary friends were imaginary, all except for this one. Her immediate thought was that maybe I had a mental disorder, but when I told her my imaginary friend was named Eduardo, well, she was certain that I had absolutely never heard that name before. That completely creeped her out. This all comes from my mom. I don't have recollection of this, but apparently over time I became more and more aggressive, saying that Eduardo needs meat. He says he can't live on vegetables. Every time I see him, he tells me he is starving to death, and he cries and he begs me to find some meat. Then, a week or two into this, I came into my mom's room on a Saturday morning. I was very upset, crying and hyperventilating. My mom asked me what was wrong. Through the tears, I told her that Eduardo told me that he had become so hungry that he finally couldn't help it. He had spent all morning outside catching birds for food. And then, me being overwhelmed with emotion, cried out, and he had blood all over his mouth. My mom was disturbed by this, of course, but she comforted me and sat me in front of the cartoons and gave me a bowl of cereal. She was pretty shaken by what had happened that morning, by the words that I had said, but as soon as she stepped out on the front porch, her uneasiness turned into stark fear. On the porch, not far from the front door, were the severed heads of 2 crows. She said it looked just like somebody had twisted off their heads. No other parts found anywhere. When my dad got home, he grilled me about Eduardo and the birds. I guess my parents couldn't decide what was worse, Eduardo being a real man I've been hanging out with, or their son thinking and seeing something that isn't there and killing animals. Or Eduardo was not human and was spending lots of time with their son. All bad choices. A couple of nights later, with my parents still stumped with what to do, it was about 2 or 3 in the morning when my parents woke up and saw me standing next to their bed. My dad asked me what was wrong. I whispered to my parents, Eduardo says he doesn't know what he'll do if he doesn't get some kind of meat. He says he'll eat anything, and he looks really hungry, Dad, and he keeps licking his lips at me. My dad sat up in bed, wide awake. Where is he? He's in my fort. My dad thundered into the room. He was screaming, Where are you? Come out here, you little piece of S! Dad was in full rage mode. He started ripping through the fort, tearing it apart, blankets and pieces of pipe flying everywhere. I apparently didn't care at this point, or so I'm told. I was so scared of Eduardo, I didn't care what happened to get rid of him. My dad continued ripping through the fort, only stopping to scream at Eduardo. Stuff like, show yourself, and leave my family alone. As my dad ripped down the last part of the fort, my secret hideout room, he suddenly stopped. He was frozen. There, in the middle of what had been my secret room, was our dog, Victory, laid out on the floor, bleeding, unresponsive. My dad picked up Victory in his arms and ran to the car. He shouted to my mom to call the vet and tell him to meet Dad at his office. I guess I fell asleep sometime that night. Early the next morning, I woke up in my parents' bed with my dad sitting next to me. Where's Victory? I asked. My dad explained that Victory will be okay, but it looks like she's gonna have to lose one of her legs. She had a big wound. Something had taken a big chunk out of her leg. We ended up having Victory for almost another 10 years. My parents still have no clue as to who Eduardo was, if anything, or if it was all just a series of coincidences or something. But Somewhere in the back of my mind, I have this image of my old imaginary friend, and I have to wonder, when a kid makes up a playmate, why would they ever make up a little old man? And why would they ever make up someone who would torment them? I have to say, I guess most people didn't like the story where that guy had the dream and then wrote the story or poem, but as somebody who does a ton of writing, I really thought it was great. And that's amazing that his dream wrote it. I thought that was really good, even though apparently other people were less excited about it than I was. But enough of that. Here's my story. I work for television news in Los Angeles. About 10 years ago, I got an assignment to interview a certain reclusive rock star who had started a vineyard and winery just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. I'm sure a quick Google would be a dead giveaway as to who I'm talking about. My cameraman and I decided it would be easier just to drive out there than fly out there with all of our equipment stuff. Plus, we were both up for a small road trip. Traffic leaving Los Angeles is extra terrible in the afternoons, and this day was no exception. It's getting pretty late as we approach Phoenix. My cameraman drove for most of the trip, but he was getting tired, so at some point we had switched. We were on the highway about 70 miles outside of Phoenix, and I'm driving at this point when I see a bit of a traffic jam coming up ahead. I'm in the far right lane, and I'm beginning to slow down a bit when I hear my cameraman from the passenger seat say, "Pull over." I can't glance over at him because I'm focused on the car stopping in front of me, but I say, "Nah, I'm all good, man. I'm not even tired a little bit." Suddenly, his voice booms throughout the vehicle in an inhumanly loud and shocking way, and he just shouts, "Pull over!" It's so weird and so loud and so startling that I shamefully, without even checking my rearview mirror, just cut the wheel and swerved sharply out of my lane and over onto the shoulder of the highway. At that exact moment, a fully loaded 18-wheeler tractor-trailer crashes at full speed into the car that had been in front of us. It wrecked that car and the 3 or 4 cars in front of him. We had just barely escaped being killed by a giant truck. I looked over at my cameraman, and his eyes were as big as saucers. He says, "What happened?" I say, "You just saved our life." He says, "How did I do that?" It turns out my cameraman was asleep right up until the semi crashed into the car next to us. So, who screamed at me to pull over? Who saved our lives? And why? Hey, I'm so happy I am able to reach you. It was not easy because of my circumstances. I am currently housed at a correctional facility, and they go through all my mail, incoming and outgoing, but my girlfriend puts a show on cassette for me, and I'm able to listen to it on my earphones every week. I swear to you, it's like going on a journey outside the gates. I just close my eyes and let the stories take me wherever they go. And I showed it to a bunch of the other guys, so you got a lot of big fans in here. So shout out to my baby Lacey for making the tapes and getting this through to you. So I wanted to tell you about some of the stuff that goes on in here. This prison is haunted AF. Here's one for you. This happened just a few weeks ago. We had a brand new guy assigned to our pod, our section of the prison. It's a guard, correction officer, whatever you want to call it. You know, Former military guy, big guy, like just over 6 foot and 260 pounds of meat. His third night on the job, it's a couple of hours after lights out. I see this guy. He passes by my cell, nothing unusual, but then, all of a sudden, I hear this guy stop dead in his tracks and, like, gasp and choke. Like he just saw a ghost. And he keys his radio, and when he's talking, you can tell he's all nervous. His voice is all shaky. His voice is cracking. And he radios in that there's a medical emergency in the cell right next to me. Now, I know for a fact there's no medical emergency in the cell next to me because that cell is empty. I get up to get a better view, but I can barely see this guy from my angle. But from what I can see, this guy looks like he's going to be sick. All pale, all leaning over with his hands on his knees. So the supervisor comes down, and sure enough, the cell is empty. They open the doors and do some searching around, but they know the cell is empty. I hear the soup ask this new guy, Marlon, what's going on? And he's freaking out and saying he saw a guy hanging from the bed by a sheet. Eventually everybody goes away and it's quiet again, but I barely slept that night at all because what that new guy didn't know was that a couple of months ago, before this guy started working here, there was a guy named Perry who had done himself in that very way. It gives me the shivers every time I think about it. Anyway, I hope you're doing good, man. Thanks for reading my letter, and I'll be listening. I hope you could use this. All right, peace out. Franklin J. Dear narrator, you asked for people to send in stories of how they came to believe in the paranormal. Well, for me, love is the reason I believe in ghosts. Not necessarily the type of ghost you read about in books or see in movies. After all, what are ghosts? Ghosts are shadows of something that used to be here. The energy left when the body expires. Ghosts are the whispers of a feeling left behind. They are memories of good times and bad times that are anchored to certain places but are able to float in and out of wherever you may be. They are nowhere but everywhere in our minds and hearts at any given moment. To me, this is a lovely thought, that the ones you love never really die. When the love of my life, Gregory, passed away, I felt sure my heart would quite literally break and send me to the grave beside him. And at the time, it would have been a very welcome sleep. But amazingly, it's true. Time really does heal all wounds. And I finally opened my eyes to what is possible. After a year of mourning, I tried to return to normal life, but there was such a giant gap in my world. This canyon of empty space that Gregory once had occupied, it frightened me. It made me cry. I almost couldn't bear to think of him at all. I certainly couldn't visit the park where he proposed to me, or eat his favorite dinner, or, especially listen to all those songs we used to listen to together. So, I made a decision. I decided to fill up that gap with all my memories of him. In doing so, I summoned his ghost, and suddenly, that empty gap was filled and life was whole again. Gregory was with me constantly, and he'd never really be gone until I let him go. That is, until I stopped telling stories of the crazy things we did when we were kids, and those are the stories of our most trying times. Those are just as important. Gregory's body was gone, but his soul remained, and it was tethered to mine. Love never dies, even when the one you love does. Death is a thing that happens to the body, and love is a power that extends beyond matter and space and time. Actual love, the kind of love I'm talking about, intertwines the souls of two beings. It knits them together like two threads. It brings those together who must be together. I believe in ghosts just as if I had seen them and felt them, because I believe in love. I've seen love. I've felt love. There's a quote from the Bible you always hear at weddings. Love is patient, love is kind, blah, blah, blah. But it's so much more than that. Love is infinite in depth and length. Unfortunately, I'm told that soon I too will have to leave this place. My body will be right beside Gregory. But the love I have given will remain right here. My one wish is that those who love me will call me forth with their words and their prayers, their laughter, their stories, their memories. My hope is that they fill the gap of my worldly absence with love. Because though my death is inevitable, my love will never die.
Check out that table. And the dishes. You can see yourself. You girls really got it together.
All right, Mama.
Lemon Fresh Joy cleans down to the shine, and that's a nice reflection on you.
This is a shot in the dark.
$10 was